Every one of you. Good morning. All right, I'm so happy to see so many folks here and just so grateful. I know this is a heavy topic, but it is a topic that is utterly urgent in our national context. And it is especially urgent because it is not a sometimes thing where we see these horrible mass shootings, but it is an everyday thing. And what often frustrates me is that we have this impotency of empathy where we do not see the tragedies that are happening every day, every hour within our country. I'm really sad that unfortunately one of our great panelists, Elle Hearns, who is an award-winning activist, inspirational leader, the founder and executive director of the Marsha P. Johnson Institute. She is one of the great fighters and defenders of the human rights of black transgender people in the U.S. And, you know, her voice to me was so essential here because in the last month we've seen yet again another violent murder of a black transgender American. And that's the challenge that I see, is that this conversation is not inclusive, it is not urgent, it does not understand that this is every single day, every single hour that we wait before engaging in the strategies that would make a difference, we lose lives. And for so many of us, it is very personal. I lived for about 8 years in my neighborhood. There used to be these high-rise projects that I moved into back in 1998, and these projects were really tough, some of the hardest physical places I've ever had to live, but they were perhaps the best community I've ever lived in. From Miss Virginia Jones, who was our tenant president, to so many of the incredible women that held that community together with their spirit and with their love. When I would come home at night, I would see a courtyard full of children playing. I watched this one group of boys literally grow up. By the time they were in high school, they were some young men that just inspired me. The leader of the crew was a young man named Hassan Washington, who I literally looked at him and I said, "You are my dad in modern era." He was just as funny as my father, quick cutting wit. He was a born leader. He was smart, charismatic, and just like my dad, he was born to a single mom, born below the poverty line, born like my dad was in a segregated environment, in this case, de jure segregation, not de facto segregation, not de jure segregation. And he, like my father, was raised by his grandmother for a while right underneath me. And I remember the night I came home and I smelled in that lobby something as pungent as I hadn't smelled since I was at Stanford, some marijuana. And I knew these fellas. I said, "Okay, guys." I started smelling some pot. I started seeing some tagging going on in the lobby. And so I just stepped up my game. I said, "Hey, guys, let's go out to movies. Let's hang out." I made the mistake of letting them choose the movie. I thought it was about home improvement. It was called Saw 2. But I started making commitments to these young men. I asked them what they wanted to do, thinking about mentoring relationships I can start, but I got busy. I got busy running for mayor of the city of Newark. And I didn't get to follow through on all the things I said because I was so consumed with the 24-hour demands of a campaign. And yet I would come home at night and these guys would cheer me on. They would tell me they were going to vote for me, which they weren't 18, but that's okay. They had the intention. It was amazing the way they made me feel during this campaign, the way they had my back during this campaign. And when the campaign was over, I won the mayoralty, but I had death threats on my life, and they had to surround me with police officers. So there were police officers stationed in the project, some of the safest they had been in a long time. But you know, when kids don't want to hang out where there are police officers. So I didn't see the young men, but I was on this mission for the whole city, and I was going to protect all of my children. And I'll never forget that first summer I was mayor. It was a lot of violence in Newark. So many shootings were going on. Violent crime was on the rise, and I would show up at street corners and tell people with all my heart, all my passion, this is not who we are. We're going to drive down these murder rates. And I'll never forget, in the first weeks I was mayor, there was a shooting near Broad Street in Newark, and there's a body covered, another one low in the ambulance. I didn't affirm the humanity that was there. I just turned to the minister to the living. And I'll never forget getting home that night trying to get a few hours of sleep before yet another day of my early days as mayor. And I remember looking at my BlackBerry and going through the names of the people that were shot or injured, police reports. And then I saw that homicide right there near Broad Street. and I saw the name of the person killed, who was under that sheet, was Hassan Washington. I will never forget how long I looked at that screen, praying that the screen would somehow change, that this wouldn't be the boy that God had put right in front of me. This wouldn't be the young man that was just like my dad. And I'll never forget his funeral, Perry's funeral home in Newark, and I had already been in that perverse reality where I had seen in our city so many parents burying children. And I'll never forget it, in Perry's funeral home, it's all on one floor, but there's one floor that is one room, viewing room, that's in the basement. And I used to hate going down there. And in this case, I just felt like I was those narrow staircase descending into the bowel of a ship. And there we were, packed in that room, piled in on top of each other, moaning and growing and swaying. And all I felt was a sense of shame that God had put this boy in front of me. And I'll never forget, it was the first time I left that funeral home and cried in my office as a mayor, because all I could think is, all of us were there for his death, but where were we for his life? This panel is about that. Because for every Hassan Washington, there are hundreds of thousands more. The majority of homicides in America are young black men. We don't talk about that. We don't talk about domestic violence enough. We don't talk about suicides enough. And we allow, when it does penetrate our consciousness with a mass shooting, for so many Americans, that once the headlines fade, our sense of urgency on these issues does. And so today we have a panel of extraordinary individuals, and I am so honored that they would take time out of their schedule, that you would, to have this important conversation. I'm going to invite Dante up here to introduce the panelists, but my prayer for all of us here is that we, in our more courageous empathy, learn to something today that empowers us to be better artists of activism, to wake up the moral imagination of a country. We have lost too many people to gun violence, more in my lifetime than we have lost in every war in America combined, going back to the Revolutionary War. We are organized as a country, first and foremost, read our founding documents, for the common defense. But yet we're losing people at rates that other nations don't see when they're at war. And so my appeal to everyone here is that we understand that this is not just a gathering to hear interesting conversation. It is an urgency that we become the change that this world needs. We become agents of change, and we leave here committed to doing something, using our social media platforms or activism, do something that we didn't intend to do when we got here. We do something different, because nothing in this world will change unless we do. I'd like to bring up the extraordinary co-founder and executive director of Million Hoodies. He is a nationally recognized social change strategist. He is one of those artists of activism that I talked about. He's a person that has inspired me, given me spiritual lift and guidance. He is a gun violence prevention leader, but he is the writer. He is a writer with 12 years of experience. He is experienced in social justice movements. He's experienced in leadership development. He's committed to strengthening a larger, more progressive movement in this country that can not only make dramatic change, but that he knows that change isn't all about him. He is about leadership inspiration, generating the kind of leaders in our country that we need to win policy battles. He's a person that understands that the power of the people is greater than the people in power. And every single day of his life, he is committed to the kind of change that we need. Ladies and gentlemen, I bring up Dante Berry.
Thank you, Senator. Absolutely. Mic's on. How's everyone doing? Good morning. Good morning. How's everyone doing? right, that's better. That's better. Thank you so much to Senator Booker for the invitation to be here this morning. My name is Dante Barry. I am the co-founder and executive director of Million Hoodies Movement for Justice. Million Hoodies Movement for Justice got its start in the wake of the murder of Trayvon Martin in 2012. We provided the initial response towards the shooting death of Trayvon Martin. And since then, we've been organizing and developing infrastructure around the country, mostly supporting young people of color. We're a human rights organization that is specifically focused on ending gun violence. We also do our work through the lens of policing and economic justice, right? We believe that as young people of color, that, you know, when we talk about gun violence in this country, after the March for Our Lives, I think for some folks, particularly for communities of color, there was always a question about, well, what about us, right? Not to say that the young folks at March for Our Lives are not, we can support and elevate their leadership, but also what about the folks who have been devastated by everyday gun violence, including domestic violence, including police brutality, including economic injustice? What about us? How do we actually reimagine and build safety for our communities? So I'm really honored to be here, to be able to moderate this conversation, and to invite an extraordinary panel of folks who are leading the movement around gun violence in their own specific arena. So to start, I'm gonna invite up to the stage Greg Jackson, gun violence advocate with Community Justice Actions Fund. In 2013, Greg Jackson survived a near-fatal shooting in Washington, D.C. that hospitalized him for 21 days and physically recovering for 6 months. Greg has since been devoted to issue organizing, local community engagement, campaigning, and promoting programs that reduce violence from a preventable public health approach. Gregory is now working every day to change the conversation on gun violence prevention by leading with people closest to the pain of everyday gun violence as a National Advocacy Director for the Community Justice Action Fund. Give it up for Greg. Coming next is Michelle Rayner-Goldsby, a civil rights attorney, civil liberty law. Michelle is a lawyer, activist, and advocate for those seeking justice and fighting for liberation. As a Black queer woman living in the South, her intersecting identities inform both her practice as a criminal defense and civil rights attorney and her leadership outside of the courtroom. Michelle is regarded as one of the Tampa Bay's area leading attorneys championing cases centering state-sanctioned attacks on people of color, particularly Black women and girls. Give it up for Michelle.
Yay, Michelle.
And we have next Adazi Vokia. Atsi Vokia, I'm sorry. Atsi is a federal affairs manager at Giffords, the gun violence prevention organization founded and led by former Congresswoman Gabby Giffords. In this role, she works with members of Congress and their staff, as well as stakeholders and advocates to advance gun safety legislation. Previously, she was the events manager at the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies and senior program associate at Women's Action for New Directions. Thank you all. We want to give a shout out for Atsi. I should also say, because it would be remiss to say, I'm from New Jersey, so it's a really honor to be on stage with the Senator from New Jersey. I just have to give that shout out to folks in the room who might be from New Jersey. There is a New Jersey presence here. Just shout that out. All right, cool. So we're gonna get to the first set of questions, and we're gonna start at the end and then move this way. So Atsi, how has gun violence impacted you directly and your community? And if you want to also just provide a little bit more description about your work and who you are.
Sure, so it's really an honor to be here today. Thank you, Senator Booker, for the invitation. So again, I'm Atsi Vokia, and I'm representing Giffords, which is founded by former Congresswoman Gabby Giffords. I'm sure many of you know her story. Gabby Giffords was the victim of gun violence 8.5 years ago when she was holding a constituent meet and greet event in Tucson, Arizona. She was shot in the head, miraculously survived, but more than 6 people 6 people died and 13 people were injured in that shooting. And since then, she's really become an advocate for gun safety and ending gun violence in America. So the work that we do at Giffords and with our partner organization, the Giffords Law Center, is really focused on policy, tracking what's happening in the states and what the federal government can do to help reduce gun violence in this country. So I think how gun violence has impacted me personally, working with somebody like Gabby Giffords and seeing someone who, although she survived the assassination attempt, she lost her career and her entire life changed. She's partially paralyzed, really lost most of her ability to speak, and yet still uses the ability she has to be an advocate. And there are so many people with stories like Gabby who lost loved ones or have permanent debilitating injuries from gun violence, and that's just not acceptable. So again, the work that we do is really focused on policy and making sure that we can cut off easy access to guns, because that's a big driver of the gun violence that we see every day in our communities and also with mass shootings.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. My name is Michelle Rayner Goolsby, and I am a criminal defense and civil rights attorney out of Florida. And so the work that I do through my law firm, Civil Liberty Law, I look at the issue of stand your ground. And I think that the stand your ground laws are so important because there's an intersectionality when we think about the broader issue of gun violence, right? So most recently, I had the honor and the privilege of representing the family of Marquise McLaughlin. And if some of you who do not know about Marquise McLaughlin, he was shot down at a convenience store by a man. He pulled his gun, and his killer was not arrested for 25 days. His killer was white, Marquise was black. And it harkens back to Trayvon Martin case. And these are cases, and there's so many Marquise McLaughlins and so many Trayvon Martins that we don't know about. So, it's interesting because as a criminal defense attorney, I use the stand your ground law to defend my clients. But yet and still, I don't agree with the law. I think that it is, and not just my own personal belief, but what the stats have shown us, that it disproportionately affects Black and brown people. And when Stand Your Ground was this, brainchild of the NRA, there has been an uptick in homicides, and there's been an uptick in violence, and there's been an uptick in public violence. And I think that what I do in my work, and the advocacy piece of my work, is really working with legislators and other individuals to really address issues of Stand Your Ground and how it does connect to the broader issues that we are having in our country. I mean, this is the urgent moment. This is the issue right now of gun violence.
Cool. I guess before I share kind of how gun violence impacted me, I think it's really important we take a moment to pay homage to all the people who couldn't be here. Unfortunately, there's so many advocates for gun violence who, frankly, didn't survive that traumatic moment. Children like Makai Wilson, who was literally going outside to get ice cream and was shot down in the Marshall Heights community. Karan Brown, who was a part of a mentorship program that I was a part of called Peace Kings, who held his own gun violence prevention rally 2 weeks before he was murdered over a bottle of water in Southeast. And even people like Robert Butler, who came to me in tears because 3 of his friends were shot, and he was worried about what he's going to do with his 1-year-old daughter after trying to turn his life around. And this morning I was trying to think through, how do I introduce this? What do we talk about? But I felt guilty being on this panel because there's just so many people that are traumatized and killed and taken away from this earth and taken away from their opportunity to provide a blessing on this earth because of gun violence. And they deserve to be in this room. They deserve to be sitting next to you. They deserve to be on this panel. They deserve to be running for Congress, running for president, but they don't have that opportunity. And so I think like so many of us, a lot of us have been touched by gun violence. In 2013, I was actually shot through a drive-by shooting, actually 1 block away from here in front of the Immaculate Conception Catholic Church here in Northwest DC. And, it was a crazy moment for one, but the wildest part about it was that feeling that, I had so much more to do on earth, and this moment might be my last moment.
Wow.
That I may walk up to the gates of heaven and see Jesus and feel like, hey, my job isn't done, I'm sorry, And that was hard for me. It was hard for my family. Thankfully, God pulled me through, and I had great surgeons, Dr. Street, shout out to him. He saved me, literally saved me. But every time I come to panels like this, I can't help but to think about all the folks who weren't saved. A lot of folks that I work with now in the gun violence movement. So unfortunately, gun violence is impacting so many of us, and it's becoming a national issue now, but it wasn't an issue when Martin Luther King was killed, when Huey P. Newton was killed, when Tupac was killed, when Biggie was killed. Like, it wasn't a national issue until we're seeing these big mass televised shootings. And for me, that is so frustrating, because every day I'm working with people who are traumatized by gun violence. So I'm excited that we're having this. Thank you, Senator Booker, for bringing us up here to talk a little bit more about the solutions that exist. Every solution is not the same. When you think about urban violence, it's very different from how you attack suicide by guns, how you attack mass shootings by guns. But most importantly, there's not enough people like us in the room that are helping form this policy and create the solutions to how we reduce gun violence. So hopefully this is a great start to that.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So when I first came into this work at the national level around gun violence, the mainstream conversations around gun violence were primarily solely focused around background checks. And when I came into the national work around gun violence it was in the aftermath of Trayvon Martin, and I think a lot of folks were pivoting towards Stand Your Ground, and then Mike Brown and Eric Gardner got shot and killed, and I got some pause, like, hold up, this is not gun violence. And so I wanna talk to y'all about, you know, the intersections around gun violence that are conversations that were, I guess, the mainstream conversation that we're not likely to have around either criminal justice, domestic violence, suicide. Can we talk about what are the conversations that we aren't having that are necessary to address gun violence? And we can start at the end too.
Sure. I think you've highlighted a lot of the issues that we see with gun violence that aren't as elevated. Obviously, when mass shootings happen, they get a lot of news coverage. They're shocking, they're horrible, but I mean, as everyone has said, we know that that's not the total issue with gun violence. So I think domestic violence is a big problem. That's something that we see very often in our communities. Again, it doesn't get the national attention that mass shootings does, but that is a big problem. And also gun suicides is a huge problem. Speaking from the policy perspective, you know, we talk about things like universal background checks. They're important, but there are also a lot of other interventions that we can take to address these other types of gun violence, whether it's, you know, day-to-day gun violence in the community, domestic violence, and suicide. So one policy that's gotten a lot of conversation, a lot of coverage in the past month is this policy called extreme risk laws or extreme risk protection orders. Some people call them red flag laws, but the proper term for them is extreme risk laws. And the idea is that, you know, when you see someone in your family or someone in your household who's at risk, maybe they're at risk of suicide, maybe they're, you know, they lost a job and they're threatening violence against their boss. It's the fact that the people closest to you often know and see the signs of crisis, and they need to be empowered to be able to do something about it. So those laws give people the ability to go to the court and say, hey, here's some evidence. I'm really concerned about this person's behavior, that they might become violent. I think that, you know, we should temporarily take away their guns, give them a chance, you know, to have some other interventions, whether it's mental health, counseling, you know, suicide counseling, that sort of thing, and just intervene in the moment of crisis and prevent a tragedy from happening. Same thing with domestic violence. We have laws in every state preventing convicted domestic abusers from buying guns and possessing guns. But unfortunately, there are some loopholes. If you are convicted of stalking, for example, you're not necessarily prohibited. And we know that that's often a warning sign of, you know, greater violence if you're convicted of stalking. So there are all sorts of policies that we can look at to kind of intervene and prevent these different sorts of gun violence that, again, don't get as much attention, but suicides are more than 60% of all gun deaths. So these are things that we need to talk about. We need to end the stigma of talking about suicide and intervene when possible to prevent tragedies.
So when I think about just some of the policy issues and certain things that happen when we have that conversation around gun violence, I often I do pivot back to stand your ground. I do pivot back to even some issues with survivors of domestic violence. And one of my best friends, she took her life by suicide by gun. And I was the last phone call she made, and she was in a domestic violence situation. And she had reached out to so many people, and she wasn't able to get help. And she wasn't in the capacity to ever have a gun. And so thinking about, who has guns? Who has the access to guns? And then becomes the argument, I don't want people to take away my guns, and I don't want to do this. And I get that. There's this whole Second Amendment thing. I get it. But is that more than someone's life? Is that more than a responsibility? And I think about, if I'm here and I look at you and I think that you're a threat, I should be able to have my gun and pull it out. Is that really the best answer? And I think, to me, it really comes back to the sanctity of life. It comes back to, I see you as I see myself. I see you, we are all human. And the fact of the matter is that it's hard because as a lawyer, and especially in court, I'm bound by the law. I can't make up new laws, unfortunately. Would be really rich. I can't do that. So then we have to have people like Senator Booker who are courageous enough to challenge this and take this on and say, listen, something's got to change. We got to introduce legislation that maybe stand your ground isn't the best, way that we deal with, self-defense. Maybe the old self-defense law, it was fine the way it was. We didn't have to, everywhere is your castle. The convention center is my castle, my car is my castle, my parking lot is my castle. And really have, and I know it's cliche to say, but really have some common sense, because it is literally, I feel I have a rotating door in my office, and my wife is here and she works with me, that mothers are coming in, that their children are being killed by senseless gun violence, whether it's by a person, whether it's by law enforcement. And there has to be something more that we can do. And I will say to the piece about gun violence by law enforcement officers, I think that there's been a report that came out that that's the leading cause of Black men being killed. And we have a standard in the law that there's a standard if I, not law enforcement, Michelle Rayner, were to pull out my gun and kill somebody. Right. That standard that you have for me has to be the standard that you have for a law enforcement officer. There cannot be a separate standard.
When I was shot, only one person was allowed to get in the ambulance with me, and that was Tyler Carrington, my youngest cousin. And Tyler held my hand all the way to the hospital while I was going through this moment. This summer, Tyler lost his best friend to gun violence in Greensboro, and he held his best friend's hand, and he died. Tyler's best friend was killed by a legal gun. I was shot by a legal gun in a high-capacity magazine. And as much as we focus on the laws around gun violence prevention, we talk so much about the gun, but in reality, those laws wouldn't have saved Tyler's best friend's life. They wouldn't have prevented me from getting shot. And so there's so much more that we can do to reduce violence that's being overlooked in this movement, especially when you think about the root causes of gun violence. And that's a lot about what Community Justice Action Fund is focused on. In DC, we have a program called Pathways, where we realized that 80% of the shootings in the city were coming from 5% of the neighborhoods in the city. So as opposed to focusing on the guns, we said, well, what's happening in these neighborhoods? And we went in that list and we said, okay, who are the people who've had violent criminal offenses on their record? And we looked and said, man, a lot of people that are getting shot have been shot by someone who's already done something similar before. So as opposed to locking them up and throwing them away and making them the enemy, we said, what happens when we pour into these guys? We created a program called Pathways. They spend 9 weeks in a classroom environment learning about everything from mental health to housing to education to entrepreneurship to, hey, what does it mean to be a man? Why do I have this nickname? Where did this come from? What is this identity of a shooter and how did I become this? And when we started this program, we've had 64 gentlemen go through the program. Again, some of the people who have some of the worst records you can imagine. And 0% of them have had any criminal involvement since they've been in the program.
Wow, that's
0.
Awesome. That's amazing.
90% are full-time employed, and we've seen guys get their GED. 3 have started their own businesses. 2 have gotten custody of their kids. Some were homeless and now are becoming homeowners. And it just shows when you start to actually invest in the root causes and figure out how to reroute this tide of violence, we can make real change. You know, the fact of the matter is 393 million guns in America and only 360 million people. So no matter how hard we go on this focus on the guns, there's so many already floating around our communities. This summer when we lost Karan Brown at the McDonald's, a 10-year-old that was shot after a fist fight, we found the kid that he fought with trying to sell that gun on Instagram for $100. Right? These guns are here. They are here. And if we don't actually start focusing on the root causes of why gun violence is happening, all we will do is turn the focus on guns into a whole nother war. It'll be a war on guns. And we saw what the war on drugs did to our community. So it's really, really important. You asked about the conversations that we're not having. Most importantly, we're not having the conversations about the root causes of gun violence. We're not inviting the people who have been impacted by violence, the pain that they're feeling and the stories to the conversation. You know, we're not bringing the people who committed these crimes, the voices of redemption. We're not bringing them to the table to talk about what led them there and how can they see it changed. Right now, it's a room full of wonks and policymakers and people sitting over in their ivory tower writing these policies that have never even dare to walk the streets where all this violence is happening. And that's the conversations we're not having. And it drives me, I'm getting a little angry, bro, because every meeting I go into, it's like I walk in, I mean, we had a meeting in New York and it was like in this big fancy corporate building and we're eating bagels and orange juice. And I'm like, what are y'all talking about? You know, but this is the group that's trying to deal with gun violence. And that is a really huge problem. This is the largest conversation I've ever seen of people of color about gun violence. And that is a huge problem. So we need to, make sure that we need to make sure that we're elevating those voices, that we're creating spaces to create this policy that's driven by the people most impacted by violence and not the people most influenced by media.
That's good. Woo. That's good.
So I'm going to pivot a little bit because that was heavy and that was a lot brought up, but I think something that keeps coming up to my mind, you know, like gun violence, I think specifically for Black folks, for Black communities, Black people of color communities, it hits us in a very different way. And speaking for myself, I think the last few years of seeing Black people in the media with our death so constant, you know, it's hard to like feel hope, right? Because of the trauma of like seeing whether or not your life is actually valued in the world and in your community. It does something to you spiritually. So I want to ask some questions into the audience and then kind of pivot to like some questions about, you know, trauma to the panel. But I want to get a show of hands. How many of y'all, just raise your hand, have been impacted by gun violence in some form? Wow. Make sure y'all look around the room to see how many hands are up. Wow. So this work is very heavy for us, right? And we're not just talking about policy, we're not just talking theoretically. This is like our people, right? The people that we love, that we care about, that we know, that might be related to us, people are in our family, in our community. So I wanna kind of start again and just get a sense from y'all. What do you all do for your own self-preservation as it relates to seeing images of our people in the media being shot and killed so regularly?
Oh goodness, that's tough. That's heavy. I guess, and probably this isn't the healthiest response, when I see that, it really makes me think about my family. I'm a very lucky aunt to 3 beautiful nieces and a nephew, and I think about them going to school. I think about them, you know, and all the images that they see in the media, violence and all of that, and how that impacts them. And I think that makes me want to be in rooms like this and have conversations like this, and talk with people who are passionate about this issue and do, frankly, the little that I can as an individual to change the conversation and change the dynamics. And, change the trajectory of where we're going in terms of violence in this country. So I think just thinking about the next generation, like what legacy are we leaving for them? It's emotionally exhausting, it's physically exhausting, it's hard to talk about people being shot, being injured, what that does to their lives, to their families' lives every day. But just thinking about who's coming behind us and what we're leaving for them is kind of what keeps me going.
So that is a heavy question. For me, it is very hard for me to kind of, untangle from my work. And when you said that, I kind of teared up a little bit because there was an instance where I am working on a police shooting and I got a video, and the video was very heavy. Law enforcement was planting evidence. I mean, it was very heavy video. Person was deceased. And one of my friends from the Dream Defenders called me and was like, I need you to stop watching. Because I was like, well, I have to watch, I have to take notes. I need you to stop watching. I need you to disconnect. I need you to come with me. We're gonna go to the beach. And what I find myself is, what happens is that I have to disconnect, and then I have to get in spaces with people who are in movement spaces, specifically Black women. They are my safe space. They always will be my safe space. And my wife and people who my mother, who is, a civil rights movement activist, and just really kind of get with them to get centered. Because a lot of times when you're doing this kind of work, whether it is you're engaging in the community or whether you are doing policy or you're lawyering, it is so easy just to get just entangled with what you're doing because you just are so tunnel focused on what is before you. And then realizing I have to get entangled because if I'm not okay, if I'm not mentally okay, I can't help the moms that come in and moms and dads that come in my office. I can't, do my good, nice, slick talking to the prosecutors. I can't do what I need to do in order to be the strength for the families that come, because regardless, I think, and not only just us on this panel, but so many of y'all out here that, especially those that raised your hand that are impacted by gun violence, you are really the strength that other families and victims are leaning on, right? And so we have to be mentally okay and find those outlets of people that love us and that can support us in this work.
Yeah, for me, I think before April 21st, 2013, like a lot of folks, I was impacted by it and traumatized by it and frustrated. I could turn the TV on and turn the TV off. But when I was shot, there's no unplugging from it. Right. This is my reality from now on. If someone slammed that door too hard, I hear it, I feel it, I'm back there. If too many people are in a room and they get loud, like at all these CBC receptions, I'm like, okay, that's just, okay. That's the Soul Train line, I got it, okay, right? But it's still there, it's still there, And at first I tried to suppress it and neglect it. But there was, when I was working with the mayor's office, there was a shooting and the Mayor Bowser and I, we went to the shooting scene. And unfortunately, a mother and a 16-year-old got in an argument and a shootout, and the mother was killed. And it was really upsetting to see that, and to see a 16-year-old shoot a mother. And, and as traumatized as I was, and I remember the mayor just trying to hold it together, walking through this community, I looked around the community and it was business as usual. Right. And I'll never forget a little 2-year-old kid, I guess he was 2, I don't know, he looked 2. I don't have any kids, obviously. But he came running by us with his shoelaces loose. And I was like, man, what you doing? So I helped him with his shoelaces, and I was like, what are you doing? I'm going to the playground. And he literally ran through the police tape to get to the playground. And I'll never forget that image. And I realized that while I can unplug and we can turn the TV off and turn it on and, scroll past traumatic scenes, that little boy lives there every day. Right. And he doesn't have that. He can't unplug from it. Right. So for me, I kind of remember that, and I realized that, the reality that I'm living is not the same as before when I was shot. And whenever I do get frustrated or gets too hard, too heavy on me, I think about him and his environment, how he's depending on me and depending on us, everybody in this room, to change that environment, or else he's going to keep running past that tape to get to the playground. And so I think that's critical. I mean, personally, I do other stuff too. I play like flag football and try to run and, drink a little bit, but, yeah, I saw you drinking, yeah. So self-care is important. Self-care is important.
It is very important. Gosh, Greg, come on.
My bad.
That's so funny. Yeah, I'll share mine because I actually do think it's important for us to, like this work is hard and we're talking about people's lives.
Yeah.
And oftentimes when we see people's lives, particularly if they're Black, like we see ourselves. And so like for me, I sometimes get into a position where I just work because I want to keep stopping the fact that like people are dying because I see myself. And that actually is, I'm actually killing myself rather than actually saving myself. And so I'm kind of like in a spirit right now of like how do we create more parties? How do we create more spaces where people feel safe and is accompanied by joy? Like how can we make people laugh more? So that's where my self-care is. So now back to some policy. What needs to be done on the federal level to address gun violence?
Oh gosh, everything. To be honest.
Literally.
Yeah, so I want to piggyback off of what Greg was talking about earlier. Just these programs that are rooted in the community that are focused on both, the causes of gun violence and sort of how to heal communities. So, Greg talked a lot about the great work that's being done in DC. But there are a few cities all over the country that have really taken this on. So looking at, as Greg said, the small group of people who are driving the violence, providing them with social services, with education, with job training, and really interrupting the violence. There are also a lot of great programs that are based in hospitals. So targeting people, in that moment when they have been shot or injured, when they might be thinking about retaliation, just helping them to kind of take a different path, providing them with services, with counseling, and trying to end the cycle of violence and trauma. So that's something that we're seeing growing across the country. Oakland in particular, they implemented these services in the hospital, the community services, and they saw a 50% reduction in their homicide rate in just 6 years. So, and what's really important and what's really unique about this is it's people who look like us who are leading these programs, who are a part of the community, who know what's going on and really have credibility and a moral authority to go in and to interrupt the violence. So going back to policy, I think one of the things that we would really like to see is just money for these sorts of programs. We need consistent investment. A lot of these programs are funded by individual foundations. City will scrape together money, maybe some states will throw money in, but the reality is the federal government has the money to fund these programs nationwide, and they make a huge difference, and they're not expensive. If you look at the cost of gun violence in this country, and if we're looking at just hospitalizations, criminal justice costs, we spend $229 billion a year on gun violence. And that's not talking about the lasting effects of trauma, people losing their jobs, all those other costs of gun violence. Just looking at the medical costs and the law enforcement costs, $229 billion. But these programs cost as little as $1 million a year. So that's something from a policy standpoint that it's important for us to invest in because, again, it empowers people in the community to do the work to heal their own communities. It's not policy wonks like me coming in and telling people what to do. It's people who know what's going on in the city who, can help to interrupt the violence and to save lives. But I think we also have to talk about, as I said earlier, the fact that it's way too easy to get your hands on a gun. That's where policies like universal background checks come in, where we have to look at trafficking. In places like Chicago, where they have strong gun laws, you still see so much gun violence because you can just drive across the border to Indiana and get a gun, bring it into Chicago, and cause violence. So there are a lot of different policies that we need to look at to make it much harder for people to get guns. I know that's not popular with people who are pro Second Amendment, but the fact is we see the consequences of people being irresponsible with guns every single day, and it's unacceptable. Making it a little bit harder to get a gun is something that the American public agrees with. That's something that we should do. So at the federal level, we have to do all we can to make it harder for people to have guns.
So one of the things, and just kind of picking back about the programs that you and Greg talked about, I know I'm part of an organization in Florida, Menace Bar Association, which is the African American lawyers. There's a designation for juvenile offenders called PJO, prolific juvenile offender. So just let that sit with you. And most of these PJOs are kids that look like us. So when you have a designation on you at 12, 13 years old as a PJO, you already kind of know what your life may or may not look like. So one of the things that we did is we worked with one of our state senators to get funding to start a jobs program in one of the communities that it was rampant. It was car thefts, gun violence, and we were able to start a jobs program. And what we've been able to see is that some of these kids who are quote unquote PJOs just needed someone just to kind of pour into them, right? Someone to kind of love on them and someone to kind of say, no, like I know that you can be better than what you are. We partnered with other community businesses to hire them and to have them start working. So when I think about that, and we only had $100,000, that's all we had. And it is a program that we are, other people said, well, we want to help you. So if we can do that in our little Tampa Bay area, how much more could we do on a federal level? How much more if, different senators and congressmen and women decided, let me take, sections from my constituency, and then also just on a whole federal level, let's see what we can do to start pouring into these programs and pouring into these, I think, really these kids in these communities. Also, my other part, what we can do on a federal level, and I don't mean to get too political, but here I am. So, we need to have leadership in the White House, and we need to have leadership as the Senate Majority Leader, period, point blank. And I will say this, I was watching CNN, and you have a Senate Majority Leader saying, hey, I'll do a gun control legislation if the president backs it. That's a profile in courage, isn't it? It's not. And because what you're telling people is, my right, my individual right is so much more important than your life. And it is, and once again, Senator Booker, I can't thank you enough. And people like you and your colleagues that are saying, absolutely not, enough is enough. Because at some point, we have to have on a federal level, and that is why we all have to be engaged, and we have to get our community engaged, and we have to let people know in our community. And that's one of the things I also think is so important. We have people like, yeah, I'm not gonna vote because it doesn't really matter. No, it does matter, and we have to talk to them at where they're at, because we're kind of up here and we have a little bit of privilege, we have a little bit of whatever, but meeting people where they're at, because you have people who are sitting, I'm not from DC, so sitting across somewhere, and they don't care about our lives, because you would rather have some political power than saving someone's life, than making sure that there's common sense gun laws, than making sure that there's money to be poured into these programs. And so to me, that's what can be done on the federal level. Get dude out the White House and let's flip the Senate, but that's just me, so.
I think they both covered it pretty well. I just wanted to emphasize a couple other points. One, there's no real national research around gun violence. And gun violence, no matter how you feel about it, this is a public health crisis.
Yep.
Crisis. If this many people died of anything else, if there was an outbreak of measles, right, and we lost this many lives and 500,000 people were surviving measles, it would be pandemonium. Right? But gun violence is terrorizing our communities, and we have no research on it, and that's by design. Okay? National research around gun violence and gun violence prevention has been defunded by lobbyists that are funded by the NRA. And so until we turn that tide to actually look at why this is happening, what the solutions are, which programs really work, then we can't even empower our legislators and policymakers to really implement that. So I think that's kind of ground zero for this, is we need research. Secondly, again, I just want to emphasize, we really have to invest in those most impacted by gun violence. When I was in the hospital, I'll tell you who I met. I met 3 investigators that asked me how I got shot and why I got shot and what I was selling and what I was doing there and who was I with and where was I going, right? I met my doctor, I met the chaplain, and that was it. After that, go home, good luck, you're good, pat you on the back. There was no support services for me. And I'll never forget, my nurse said, Greg, you are just lucky. You get to go with your family. I see kids come through here every day who have to go right back into the neighborhood where they came from, and they have to hop on the metro,
Wow.
And that stuck with me because there's not enough survivor support services out there for people who survive gun violence.
It's really good.
Secondly, the programs that are invested in people who are returning citizens is laughable in most states. And I think about a young man named Robert Butler. He did 5 years in prison for armed robbery. He robbed someone for $11,000. And he always tells me, man, it felt like a big score until I had to spread out over 5 years. And that $11,000 didn't seem like much. But when he came back home, I really saw with a little bit of investment what he could do. He's got his first apartment. He got custody of his daughter now. He said, Greg, I'm trying to get a house. What should I do? I said, man, well, first you got to check your credit score. He had a better credit score than me. I was like, damn, I had like a 7. I was like, man, what you doing? But so he's about to buy a house, probably bigger than mine, But his story is always telling, because he was part of that Pathways program and a lot of different services in DC to help him, step his way back into the community in a positive way. And now, not only is he doing great things, he's leading folks out of his neighborhood to do other things. He's pulling them into Pathways program. I saw real quick story. I saw him pull up to our office, and it was like 4 guys outside, and they was like talking trash and stuff. And the police rolled by, and they was like throwing fingers up at the police. I was like, who are these kids, man? I said, Rob, who are they? He said, oh, that's my man. Don't worry about them, man. They're getting their GED. I was like, oh man, I appreciate that. So he literally picking these guys up from the hood he's from and bringing them in for services and programs. And it just shows you, when you start to invest in those most impacted, a lot of them don't want to live that life. They want to move on. They didn't choose that life. They were pushed into it. They were forced into it. They fell into it. So I think federally, just the foundation of it is like, how are we going to invest in those most impacted by violence to help turn this tide, and not just these Band-Aid fixes that we're seeing right now.
Awesome. So we're going to pivot from federal to local. Gun violence is a very local community problem, and there are lots of programs, interventions that folks are making every single day that are under resourced, not amplified enough. What are they, and can you share a little bit about some programs that that the folks that in the room should know about?
Yeah, so I think I talked about this a little bit earlier. Greg talked about the Pathways programs. Those are the sorts of programs that we need. I think we need, at the local level, to look at what's causing people to commit gun violence. We know that there are communities that have been systematically underinvested in for decades. Places where the schools are not good. It's hard for people to get housing. We know that there are those systemic problems, and I think we have to tackle them. We have to tackle them with programs like Pathways, like the programs that we see that are based in hospitals, like what we've seen in Oakland, that are looking at all of those root causes, that are giving people opportunities to do things that didn't exist in their communities, to get a good education, to have good jobs. So those are the sorts of programs I think that we need to focus on at the local level. And I think what's really important about them is that these are programs that are keeping people out of the criminal justice system, and that's a big part of why we see this violence and a lot of the issues that we see in our communities as well. So I think it's a combination of keeping people out of the criminal justice system while investing in the community, giving them opportunities so that they don't have to turn to gun violence. And I think I wear the federal hat. That's the work that I do every day. And what we need to do is support those programs and let the people who are doing that work provide them the resources to keep doing it.
Definitely. Just, I brought up the jobs programs that we have, but I always kind of think about the work that I do. It's not possible without community organizers. It's not possible without organizations like the Dream Defenders, where they are really invested in the community. And we have a particular community in St. Pete called Child's Park. So if you go to Child's Park, and if you're not from St. Pete, you're not gonna go through Child's Park at certain times. And they canvas, they knock on doors, they have books and breakfast. They are really investing in the community, and not just with the youth, but also with adults, and engaging parents, engaging people that we wouldn't think to engage because they don't look like, or they don't have they have records, like we don't really think that we would engage them, but they are doing work in the community in order to say, no, this is your community. You have a stake in the community. And even with those kinds of organizations, we've done forums with them. So we've had forums with the community, and then you've had the sheriff, the elected state attorney there, and you have other electeds there, where the community is leading the conversation with them and challenging them on things when it comes to gun violence, and when it comes to how they police the communities, how they prosecute people for gun violence, and what that looks like. And so I really think one of the things when we look back on a local level is really, it's one thing for me to come and maybe not live in Child's Park and say, this is what you need to do. You need to do this, 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 and that. But it's so much more powerful when I say to a community member in Child's Park, I'm going to empower you to have power in your own community and really make change there. And that, to me, I think that's where the change happens. That's where the magic happens, where we allow people who reside in these communities to know that you have this collective power that you're not using. And for many reasons you're not using, because, we could talk about systemic oppression, all of those kinds of things, but we're going to allow you and give you resources that you may not have had in order to make change in your community.
And just a few more local options. Hospital-based intervention is really important. In DC and most cities actually, they have like Cure the Violence model, which is basically a focus where you actually empower and hire folks in the community. You train them on conflict resolution and trauma-based care. So you have folks that are already in these groups and in these networks that are prepared to help de-escalate situations. So that violence intervention model is really, really impactful. We talked about pathways. Another big thing that's local that we should always keep in mind is the placement of trauma centers. A lot of cities, you'll have, the violence is on one side of the town and you get shot and you got to fight all the way to the rich part of town to be helped. So that's really, really important, making sure we have quality trauma centers in close proximity to all neighborhoods and all communities. I think another big thing locally that we overlook is we need to make sure cities are investing in the infrastructure around communities that are impacted by violence. You'll be shocked at how impactful a street light is to how safe a neighborhood is, right? If you know this block is dark, this is where I can do everything I want to do. And T.D. Jakes said it in a sermon last New Year's, said, wherever there's darkness, you shine light on it, son. He went in. And I think that's a huge part of it, is making sure these neighborhoods have that light shine on them, that they have streets that work, that they have proactive services, that ambulances get there in time, and making sure these neighborhoods have the right amount of services that every other part of the city has is really critical locally. Yeah, awesome. It's a few.
So we're gonna wrap to one final question before we take questions from the audience. And I'd love to hear from y'all about, are there any specific projects, campaigns, or areas of work that y'all are working on that you can share with the group about how to plug in and get involved?
Oh, goodness. Yeah, so again, our work is mainly focused on federal policy. I think in the past month, we've really seen a change in people demanding action from Congress and from the Senate. And Senator Booker, my apologies. I know you do what you can, but Mitch McConnell's really something else. So I think it's really, really important to keep the pressure up, because frankly, a lot of these politicians that are bought and sold by the NRA will only be moved if they feel like, okay, if I don't do this, I'm gonna lose my job. And so we have to hold our elected officials accountable. These are all steps that we know will make a difference in terms of saving lives, that just make common sense. It's too easy to get your hands on a gun, and that needs to change. So one of the things we're focused on is just continuing to organize people in communities to hold their elected officials accountable, to register to vote, and to remind them every single day that they're not taking action, that these are the people you're going to have to answer to. So that's something that we encourage, is to continue to speak out and speak up and call on elected officials to do their jobs, to keep our community safe and to save lives.
So I have this arm of my law firm that I'm developing, and we have a phrase that's in my law firm that I wear shirts. It says justice over everything. And when I think about justice, I'll get you a shirt.
It's dope, yeah.
Yeah, you want a shirt? I got you. Okay, cool. So we may have some here. I don't know. But when I think about justice over everything, I just don't think about just one area. And so one of the things, as I was kind of thrown into the work about Stand Your Ground, I mean, I really was like, I'm just gonna be this nice, good country lawyer, criminal defense attorney, and God had other plans. Said absolutely not. And so when I think about the work that we're doing around Stand Your Ground, one of the aspects with that is that we're forming a policy arm of my law firm, and we are getting young people, and not just law students, but like young people, high schoolers, college age students, because I feel like that there's so much just energy and intelligence and so much innovation there to really think about creative ways to look at issues when it comes to Stand Your Ground, to think about the intersectionality of gun violence and Stand Your Ground. So we are developing a policy arm where we're gonna have students work on policy issues, and then obviously hopefully present, maybe one day meet with people like Senator Booker to really talk with ideas. So that's some of the work that we're doing. Obviously still advocating for Black families, Black women, Black trans women. I think that's super important. I want to kind of uplift Black trans women. Just in Florida, I think this week was the 18th trans woman that was killed by gun violence. And to me, that's an epidemic. And that is something that as a cisgendered woman, I also need to step in the gap for my sisters, right? And in gun violence, how it is just pervasive around trans women. So looking at those kinds of issues, so that's some of the work that we are doing. So, and if you guys ever want to get involved, just pull me aside and we will welcome it.
Yeah, I mean, for us, I think it's very clear that the concentration of poverty is not a mistake. The saturation of guns in our neighborhoods, it's not by coincidence. Right. The trauma that lives in all of our music and our television and everything that we do every day, that's not a coincidence. All this stuff is by design. And one big thing that the Community Justice Action Fund is, we are launching a campaign called By Design, where we're trying to shine a light on all of these oppressive institutions and factors that are really influencing and encouraging gun violence in our communities. So hopefully you all will be a part of that. Please, you can follow us on social media. Please amplify these messages, but it's important that we show people that it's not just the gun that's causing the violence, right? Of course, that's a huge part of it, but there's so many factors that weigh into that, and a lot of them are institutionalized oppression that we have to address. So we'll be doing a series of digital messaging campaigns around it. We're doing regional trainings where we're training folks about what this means and how to message around it. We're also doing trainings with a lot of the local organizations to teach them how to advocate more for the resources they need to be successful. But that is our big focus right now, is our By Design campaign. So hopefully you all will be a part of it. Thank you.
Awesome. And I wouldn't be a good organizer if I didn't plug our work either. We're working on a campaign called Free Vallejo in Vallejo, California, out in the Bay Area. There's been about 16 fatal shootings by police since 2011. And Vallejo is a very small community with a police department of about 100. And so that is huge. So we have a campaign that we launched a few months ago, really looking at the intersection of policing, gun violence, and economic justice. So if you want to get involved and learn more, go to millionhoodies.net and freevallejo.com. So we have our very first question.
Wow, yes. No
Senator
pressure.
Booker.
People will line up behind me if they have a question to ask. Give it up for the panel one more time. I was telling my staff I'm like falling in love up here. I want my T-shirt too. Do not give him a T-shirt and not give me a T-shirt.
I got you.
But I just believe that most common way we give up power is not realizing we have it in the first place.
Right.
And so I'm dying for it. It doesn't have to be all of you, but to give a directive to us. I know you all been telling me what I got to do using my position, but for everybody here, we are powerful. This room is powerful. We have the ability to make change. What is one thing that you, or it doesn't have to be one, tell us what we can do that we weren't planning on doing when we came in here. What can we do? Give us some specific directions.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. So in your community, seek out that local program or initiatives that are focusing on supporting those most impacted by violence. I think a lot of these groups exist. Unfortunately, so many of us have been impacted. A lot of people have started their own movements, but a lot of times they're doing it in their garage or in their corner or in their church. So find those groups, invest in them. A lot of them need donations, they need funding, they need Instagram followers. Like, invest in them holistically, and don't just look at this as a broader national policy issue, but look at right in your neighborhood what you can do to invest in those most impacted.
I would definitely agree. My one thing that I always talk about is that find a kid. I mean, go to a school that is in a community that is impacted by gun violence, that is impacted by things that are just, some just disproportionate, injustices. Find a kid. I mentor this one young girl at this one community, and her teacher was like, "Oh, she's so bad." And I was like, "Really?" I said, "She's not bad. She's spirited. Like, she's not bad." And and they label our children bad, or they label them this, and it's not that they're bad, that they're spirited, that they want to have someone to talk to. So take a kid, and to me, that is like that's what I do. That's what my mom, I'm a member of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. So, all right. We're not gonna do too much in here, but my mom, she's a Delta Deer, and so she's an older member. And my mom, she'll go and she'll get involved with the kids. And so you have to find where you have the capacity to work in.
Oh, go ahead.
No, I agree with both of those. I'll say two things. I think vote.
Yes.
And I say run for office so you can vote for yourself, because who knows what's going on in your community better than you do. I think it's important to be an advocate, but you can't change the system entirely if you're not participating in it. I think, across the country, there aren't enough elected officials who look like us, who think like us, who have had our experiences. So I think vote and run for office is very, very important.
And we need to demand a hearing on violence in communities of color, right? On the Senate, on the Hill, looking at you. And y'all need to do that at every reception. Find that member of Congress and talk to them and say, when are we actually going to address this issue like we do mass shootings, like we do so many other big issues, the opioid crisis? When are we going to look at this and really talk about it and bring those voices forward? So please do that. Call your senator, call your member of Congress and tell them, look, let's talk about this issue. Don't just work on it in the corner.
Thank you. My name is Brenda Seiler, wearing two hats. I'm a contributing writer for the Washington Informer newspaper here in DC, and I'm also with the Carol H. Williams Agency. We've been contracted to reach out to communities for Census 2020. Two-part question. Mental health seems to be the default rationale for gun violence. We know there are a range of diagnoses under mental health. Could you talk a little bit about this, because it seems to be an easy out for a lot of people who want to place blame, especially on the mass shootings. Also, the conversation, the mention that you said about trauma centers in our neighborhoods, street lights in our neighborhoods. When you respond to the census, that makes things happen. So think about that in March when you get your census information in the mail.
Sure, I can take the question about mental health. I think you're exactly right. We especially see that on the Republican side of things, that they want to blame all gun violence on mental health, and we know that that's just simply not true. Just looking at studies of just mass shootings and school shootings, very few, if any, of those shooters had any sort of diagnosable mental health condition. So I think it's very false to blame mental health on gun violence. We can blame it on easy access to guns. We can blame it on the fact that we have a rise of white nationalism and domestic terrorism in this country, and the fact that it's so easy to get a gun makes it easy for those people to express their violent intentions. So I think where mental health does come into play with gun violence is, like Greg was saying, victims needing counseling. Communities need help dealing with this long-lasting trauma, but simply blaming mental health for all gun violence is completely false.
I don't want us to underestimate the value of mental health and therapy. In our program with Pathways, it's voluntary, but every individual goes through, they have their own therapists and they talk to and work with, and you would be shocked at how refreshing they are, or how really like they love it. You know, we saw the program ends in 6 months and they're still coming back. I want to go back again in a week, because they have so much built up anger and frustration in their own trauma for the violent crimes that they've been a part of or survived or committed. So I do think it's important, especially in the communities of color, that we continue to invest in mental health therapy, because frankly, so many neighborhoods are just traumatized right now, and they don't even know how to process the trauma. And there's no one there to even work with and talk to. So I think it's critical. I also think it's critical that we try to train folks who are already kind of natural therapists, like your barber and your beautician, to make sure they know how to help you cope with the situations that are going to, because everyone's not going to go to a counselor or therapist, but we as a community need to know how to help each other, you know, and help each other medicate mentally without, you know, turning to drugs or turning to violence or turning to unhealthy means. So I think it's critical. I just don't think it's the only reason why we're dealing with this situation.
Hi, I've come here from Ohio, and I wanted to kind of briefly touch on the things you spoke about on the national level first, which is funding for research so that we can quantify. I heard you say that. Yeah. I also like to say that funding to support programs that are already showing the statistics, like the statistics you cited, and other local people who are working on the efforts. As far as a local level in Ohio, we have some things that we're trying to push there. The legislation that's been drafted that's up for vote does talk about stricter laws, because the guns that I heard shot you, those are legal guns, firearms that you spoke about. And then also we have a restraining order law that says that this person who is suffering with these issues needs to be temporarily separated from their Second Amendment right to hold these firearms. So a temporary restraining order is the other thing that we're working on in terms of the mental health thing, because we know the mom in El Paso, most of you already know, she sought help from the FBI, she sought help from law enforcement, knowing that her person that she gave birth to and loved didn't need to be near their firearms. We're also working on a red flag law, which research is going to be important for, because who do we red flag? How do we do that? How do we preemptively, and how would that impact Black communities? Also, there's a thing like you're talking about with the stand your ground, where there are people who feel as gun holders that they can morally enforce their idea of who does and doesn't have a right to exist, who does and doesn't challenge their comfort zone, and that is definitely a problem. And I guess my question is like what the great senator said today, which is how do we hold, as constituents, how do we hold our representatives responsible, and what do we demand of them? Because they will show up if we ask them. Few of them are enemies. If we do present them something comprehensive that we want, they will respond. So what is, in your opinion, the comprehensive request that we need to make in regards to what we want as constituents?
Comprehensive. Comprehensive. Wow, I think there's so many wonderful things that you touched on. So many, I mean, everything you touched on I think was spot on. And it really, this work is so broad, and it does encompass so much. And I'm gonna let my learned colleagues talk about some other things, but I'm gonna touch on stand your ground. And I think one of the things is that Florida was the first state in the country to have a stand your ground law, 2005. And since then, I think there's like, Dante, maybe like 32 states that have followed? Just about 32 states that have followed. So one of the things is that we have a couple of state senators and reps that are really challenging stand your ground. And so one, get behind them, make sure they get in office. Two, the ones that are not wanting to deal with stand your ground or thinks that it's fine the way that it is, get them out of office. And I tend to be a person, and just maybe that's how I work, I will be on your behind all the time. So if it's writing letters, if it is calling, if it is activating other individuals to run against this specific person that does not think that this is a matter of urgency. I remember when Marquise was killed, Andrew Gillum, he asked the governor to hold a special session and to deal and declare a state of emergency with Stand Your Ground. And we had another Democratic senator, stand with him. And it was divided, all of the Democrats, but no, there was maybe one lone Republican representative that was in agreement. And it is in our state, it is a state of emergency because it happens all the time. So I think that when you look at who's representing you and what you can do as a constituent, you have the power to get them out of office. And I think we think about that conceptually, but I don't think we really activate that power to get them out of office.
Yeah. I think it's really important that I think we should start locally, to be honest. There's so much that can be done at the mayor and city level and state level that has not been touched. And a lot of cities, unfortunately, are dealing with spikes in violence right now, and states as well. And they're searching for solutions. A lot of leaders are just throwing police at the problem because they don't know what other solutions exist. So I would encourage us to start locally. We can do both, right? And you can look at communityjusticeactionfund.org to see our full comprehensive policy agenda as opposed to me rattling it off. But I really think that's a critical angle that we should take.
Yeah, I'd say I just agree with both of them. I think being present in the room makes a big difference. It sounds like that's what you're doing, but I think just continuing, like everyone said, to hold elected officials accountable. It's so easy for them to sort of look at things from, a very dispassionate perspective, especially if it's an elected official who doesn't feel like this is an issue that affects their community and their constituents. So I think being present in the room, putting a face to the problem and letting them know how you and your community are impacted by the decisions they make is important.
Hi, my name is Deatra Harris. Unfortunately, the senator is not here. I wanted to address some legislation actually that he introduced with some of his colleagues, but you mentioned root cause and you mentioned research, and I've been working with my organization for 6 years in distressed and marginalized communities here in the States and around the world. And there are 3 things that I see consistently, and that's the lack of identity, whether it's self-identity, community identity, or historical identity, lack of trust, and lack of engagement. And so my question is, how do we use policy to create a coalition or consortium within that ecosystem so that community members can be a part of not only planning, but be a part of that phase to implement these policies through implementation?
Well, I think there's a couple of different ways to do it. I know in Oakland, they have a annual training around gun violence and conflict resolution where the community-based organizations are part of it. And not only do they get trained on tactics, but they also get to weigh in on some of the solutions and the policy that's needed. So that's the way the government can kind of open the door to bring in the community. In Washington, D.C., all of our violence intervention work is done through community groups. And so we actually outsource and partner and fund that. So the communities are actually leading the change, and the government is just that resource that they can always turn to if they need support around employment services, housing services, et cetera.
Right, and like you said, I think the gun violence is a symptom of a bigger problem. So my question is, we need to get to the bigger problem, which is part of it is those 3 things that I mentioned. We have a historical lack of trust with the government and people coming into our communities telling us how to live. So how do we get around that? I believe it's building a consortium with that ecosystem, whether it's city government, federal government,
Yep.
community leaders, you know what I mean? Instead of doing it piecemeal, how do we come together to really see changes that are needed in these communities, getting to the source?
I think we just need to build those spaces. And certain cities are doing it, others aren't, and nationally we're not doing it. So building that space for that type of collaborative effort is critical. And I feel like this is actually a really good start.
To actually get to his point a little bit, even I think there's only nationally like 3 Black-led organizations working at the national level around gun violence. So just want to elevate, I think your question is real, and I think there's in terms of infrastructure, there's still things that are missing.
Hi, wow, she was really tall. One thing that President Obama said that was very poignant and resonated with me is that the best way to address poverty is with a job. And when you look at communities that are most affected by gun violence are those that are economically depressed, people living below the poverty line. So if the senator was here, I was going to share, or ask, what are we doing to create jobs, especially in manufacturing? Because, not everybody's going to go to college and get the quote-unquote desk job. I think manufacturing can help a lot of people and uplift their economic situation. And second, another thought to think about is Medicare for all. Now, everybody's trying to figure out how to do this on a national level, and it'll be great if we had it, but I think the way we should be thinking about it is get it on a local level, a county level or municipal level, so that, we can expand services in mental health and drug rehab and things of that nature. So any thoughts on that as a way to address gun violence?
As far as jobs, one of the programs that I mentioned earlier is, we were able to secure a grant. And one of the things that we did is that we actively went in the community and talked to different community business owners who, are you willing to hire this young man, this young woman? Are you willing to hire this young man, this young woman with knowing they have a juvenile criminal background? Are you willing to work with them? And so what we did is we said, you're in this community, you're wanting things to change, and we challenged them to be a part of that change, right? And so what we're finding is that the kids, the reports that we're getting back from the different businesses is that the kids that were kind of I hate to say it, but that's what our sheriff said, the throwaway kids, essentially the ones that aren't going to be anything and they're just going to keep doing, crime, that they were the ones that worked the hardest. They were the ones that were invested. They were the ones that were promoted quicker. And they just really needed someone to kind of take a chance and invest in them. And it wasn't always an easy transition. So it's in like some, The Blind Side or something like that. But it was something that was really, you had to be invested in working with children and working with these young people and investing in them even when it wasn't easy, even when it was hard. And so I think that for us, it's easy to talk it, but we have to walk it. And we have to walk it in a way that we are at whatever capacity that you're able to invest back into that community, whether it's hiring people, whether it's mentoring, whether it's, work. I can't do pathways, but I can say, Greg, here's a check for how much. Do what you need. Go. The amount. Okay, we'll talk about that. Because he's gonna have me on the record and then be like, you remember you had. But that's what I think is important. So whatever that capacity is. So if you don't have the time to mentor, you can find an organization and say, listen, I can't do this, but I'm going to fund the work that you're doing. And I do agree that jobs and investment in people are what kind of starts to change that tide.
So we're going to take one more question and then we'll close.
Okay, well, I'm fortunate that I get the last question. Hello, my name is Dr. Lawrence Robinson. I'm a medical doctor, and I actually deal with this issue every day. I'm a addiction psychiatrist.
Oh, wow.
And I treat people who are addicted to opiates. The first thing I wanted to do is I wanted to let the brothers up there know that you're not alone in this fight. In fact, just a couple days ago, the National Medical Association had a meeting, and it was led by the medical examiner of Washington, D.C., to address many of the issues that you're talking about now. We have called for increased research, and we say that the issue of violence is a public health problem. It's not a criminal justice problem. And when you look at it from the standpoint of a public health problem, then it becomes multidisciplinary.
Right.
And you bring many different public health entities in on the fight, and you don't look at it just as a criminal issue. In fact, by definition, the more police you have, the more violence you have. So that's very important. Now, there's one other thing. I'm an older man, so I've been around for a while. And I want you to know that we have had situations like this in the past. And in fact, in Philadelphia, we had a issue in terms of gang violence. And there were many strategies that were done which actually had an impact on decreasing the violence in the city. One of the issues, though, is that what you have to think about is the sustainability of your programs. Because the programs started off well, they worked well, but after years, many of these efforts, they faded away, and now in Philadelphia, we have violence rising again. We have very high rates of it again. And it's because we didn't sustain the effective programs that we had in the past, okay? And so this is what you have to ask yourself, and this is basically the question is, you know, how do you organize your community to fight the issue of violence? And I can tell you right now that it's the family, it's the minister, it's the people on the block. They are the ones who are really going to have an impact on this situation. You know, and you have actually the resources and the power to do it yourself. So let me just give you a couple examples of one of the things we did. We had a program in crisis intervention. I remember he mentioned this. What we did was we sent counselors to the morgue so that when somebody was shot, there was somebody there to talk to the people to prevent retaliation. Because when that person is shot, then now they're going to go and kill the person that did it.
Hey,
you know,
sir,
so you have to intervene on it.
Can we move to a question?
Yeah, okay. So the question is, you know, will you get together the information that has been done in the past, how you're going to compile that and make up a plan so that you utilize some of the effective strategies that have been used in the past and have proven to be effective?
Thank you.
Can I just make a statement? Hi, I am a licensed mental health counselor in DC.
Nice. We need you.
What do I do?
Yeah. No, I said, no, great. We need you.
Oh,
yes.
yeah. Well, I know.
Affirming.
And the statement I want to make is that as a licensed counselor, not a social worker, not a doctor, not a psychologist, I am not able to serve people under Medicare. There have been several bills that have not been passed, that have come through the legislature, and because of some very fierce, strong lobbyists, I'm not going to say who they represent, we are not able as counselors to serve people under Medicare. We will not be reimbursed. Now, my company is going to pay me either way. This isn't something for me to put money in my pocket. But I cannot see people who are under Medicare. So although Senator Booker is not here, I'm gonna find him, but this needs to get passed. This is ridiculous. You can talk about counselors all day long, but we can't even serve half the people in this country.
That's huge. Thank you
Thank
for
you.
bringing it up.
You can take this, young man. He was sitting right here.
Hey, how y'all doing?
Hey.
Hello.
My name is Elijah, and I'm from Chicago. I actually pushed my flight back just so I can come back here today.
Oh, wow.
So I'm,
wow.
Thank you
I'm
so
kinda
much.
seeing you right
Thank
now.
you.
Oh, wow.
Basically, in the city of Chicago, we have gang violence, gun violence. We have these kids who are caught in crosshairs, like you were hitting a drive-by accident. We have that same problem in Chicago. I live in the Hyde Park area, in a neighborhood where it's getting kind of urbanized. Jobs are coming in, so it's getting kind of brought up. But there's still other places around Chicago that are not brought up because they don't have, like they said, those economic economic opportunities for jobs. Our schools are getting closed down because our states are so corrupted, mainly in Chicago and Illinois. Our state is so corrupted and we are in so much debt that we cannot afford to build more schools, that we cannot afford to give these kids who are growing up on the streets that are impacted by the gang violence, the gun violence, and the drugs and stuff that are coming into our community. They don't have the opportunity to actually go to a school that's close to them because the schools are getting shut down because the state can't afford it anymore, because they're putting other things towards building a new wing to O'Hare Airport, or because they're giving money to lobbyists, or they're giving other things to other people that has no impact on our community. So my question is, how do we restrict these people that are in our government that we elect, that are now corrupted, that are not giving back to our community in order to stop the gun violence, and in order to help bring up our kids and the people that are growing up that are dropping out of school because the school now closed and they got to go 10 miles up north, and because our city is segregated, so how they got to go 10 miles, 20 miles up north and downtown to go from 71st and Cottage Road all the way up to media school in the downtown loop. How does the national government enforce the law of a state, local government cannot interfere with the education of these gang communities in Chicago and other places like Philadelphia and Boston?
Wow. So that was an amazing question. So I want to just uplift that. That's an amazing question. I don't know, and I think there may be other individuals. I know it's a conversation. My wife, she's here. She's an education advocate, and so she deals with these issues a lot with Title I schools and achievement schools. And how do we restrict lobbyists and national government from collaborating with state and local government? I mean, they're all in bed together. I think that's like, that's it. I don't know. I'm speechless.
I don't know.
I mean, I think a big part of it, though, is making sure that we're electing policymakers that are not being influenced by these special interest groups and aren't taking corporate donations. I mean, there's a huge movement of people that are running for office and running for Congress who are saying no to those dollars and still winning and still successful and still making a big difference. And I know it's starting at the national level, but locally we have to hold people accountable the exact same way. And it's not just, the big tobacco organizations. A lot of times in inner cities, it's that big developer that's trying to buy up these neighborhoods and turn it around, but throwing in, big condos where the average rent is $1,500 a month. So I think we need to make sure that we're looking at every elected official and holding them accountable to where their dollars are coming from, not just what they're saying on television and what their ads are, but where are these dollars coming from, so we know who they are answering to when they're in office. And unfortunately, a lot of cities, a lot of communities, they aren't answering to the people, they're answering to those donors and those corporations. So, but we can stop that. I mean, the tide is shifting. There's a great group called End Citizens United that's doing it nationally, but we need to stand behind them and make sure that we're pushing to bring in people into office that we know are serving us and not special interests.
I think, Greg, that's such a good point, because I know for us in one of the areas that we lived in, I had to just kind of get over the heaviness of your question because it was so just so high level that I was just like, wow. So, but now kind of, thinking about it, I know that one of the school board members, we pulled the receipts, for lack of a better term. We pulled the receipts, and the reason that she's not doing what she needs to do for the Title I schools and achievement schools because she's bought by charter schools.
Done.
So if you're bought by charter schools, you have, and they pay for you to be the school board woman, chairwoman rather, you have no incentive to make sure that Title I schools or make sure that schools in inner cities are doing well, because a private charter will come in and say, oh, you're an F school? Okay, we'll take care of it. We'll take over the school. So once again, I think it comes back to, we have a saying in my household, people lie, receipts don't. So we have that saying. And so start pulling the receipts. I think you start pulling them and you hold them accountable. So you're bought by such and such charter school. You're bought by such and such developer. Okay, so there is no interest that you have for us in order to make our education better, because you're going to get just a little bit of money. So, you sell your soul for 30, pieces of silver, just a little bit of money in order to make sure that, the kids are going to somewhere else and they're not being taught appropriately in their communities.
Yeah, I mean, I think they really covered it, but you have to hold people accountable, you know? When people are doing things behind the scenes, they think that people don't know about it, they'll keep doing that. But people like you calling them out, voting them out, I think is really, really important. So keep doing your good work.
So I got the okay for the final two.
The final two.
What we'll do is that we'll have, if you can ask your question, and we'll do both questions at the same time.
Okay, cool. Hello, panelists. Thank you all for coming today and sharing your thoughts and your experience on criminal justice reform. My name is Anthony White. I reside in Baltimore, originally from the Midwest. So I have a statement. Gun violence is not just a situation, it's an injustice of trauma-filled violence on communities of color who remain hostage to erroneous laws and legislation, literally stopping them in their tracks. And so I think we all kind of know a lot about that. People have been directly, indirectly, myself, I've been directly and indirectly impacted by gun violence. So my question is, I took a lot of notes. One of you spoke about the $229 million that are annually spent on gun violence. I don't know if it's prevention, not from the federal government. I think that was you, Adula. What was it?
UDSI.
UDSI, excuse me, UDSI. So my question is there any proposed legislation that is going to take money away from that and put it into like community-based organizations to help prevent gun violence? And if so, what proposals are out there that you may know about in this new legislation year? Okay. Thank you.
You want me to go ahead?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Hi, I'm Amber Sansberry. I'm a PhD student in education policy and early childhood. So there is good research happening. So I have a question for you, Greg. Particularly, the research that we're doing is with Black families that are resilient and living in public housing communities. So if you could share any resources or any strategies of you, particularly for public housing communities that can be hyper-policed. Thank you so much.
So to the question about resources, so it's $229 billion that we spend, and that's money that taxpayers are spending on, ambulances, on through Medicare, and that's treating victims of gun violence. That's responding with law enforcement. So I think some of the things that are happening in Congress is there are conversations about the effectiveness of these community-based programs that we've sort of talked to death up here, and how to invest in them. So I think there are legislators who are interested in introducing bills to provide funding for those sorts of programs, and empower communities to continue doing their work, to have sustainable funding to do their work, to interrupt violence and kind of prevent the cost that we have to spend when people are shot and killed. Yeah, so those would go through both Judiciary Committee and the Appropriations Committee. So those bills haven't been introduced, but there are conversations, and I'm happy to talk more about that with you, one-on-one.
Yeah, and I guess to the second question, actually, one more thing on the first question. What we had to do at a city level is really assess what does that $229 billion look like in the city and per homicide. And that's a pretty strong argument. I think our number was around $400,000 is what the city has to pay after a homicide happens due to gun violence. And when you look at it that way, it's very easy to make that argument to your city government or your local government to invest in these programs, because it literally will pay for itself. Right. In our DC, our police department has a budget of $556 million, and our preventative services has a budget of $5.7 million. Yep. Right, so it just shows you kind of that's in DC, but we're trying to shift that tide. But the biggest argument is showing them that what the cost is of not investing in preventative measures. As far as public housing goes, there's a lot that can be done specifically in families and public housing. I think one big thing we notice is the conditions are critical. In DC, gun violence spikes during the summertime. And even on my block, man, right now, I'm sure it's like 60 guys out there rolling dice or something, And they cool, man. They cool. They ain't doing no harm. But I'm always wondering, like, why y'all outside all the time? And so I was like, y'all, it's 9 in the morning. I just woke up and you out here, you know, chilling, rolling up, whatever. And one day I just asked them, I said, why y'all always outside? And they said, man, it's hot. And I was like, yeah, it's hot. Why you outside? But they don't have air conditioning in their housing, and that's not mandated. And so that makes perfect sense. If I didn't have air conditioning in my house, I wouldn't be sitting inside the house either. So I think, one, by making sure the conditions in public housing is more positive or at least humane is really critical to making sure that the family dynamics play out in a good way. Also in DC, there's a lot of, and I don't know if this is all federal or whatnot, but there's a lot of incentives to not be a whole family, to not be married, you know, and when it comes to a husband and wife in a home, there are limits to what type of housing access you have. And in a city that's going through the fastest gentrification in the country, with ridiculous cost of living, for a lot of folks, they're trying to figure out where can they stay. And if they know that being separated is only way they can get housing, they're going to stay separated. And that's not a small thing. I'm talking about thousands of people who are couples but are separated just so they can be have somewhere to stay. And you have grown men that are homeless. They'll never say it to you, but they're homeless. They're sleeping on the couch, but they got to sneak out the house before someone inspects and checks and realizes they're there. So I think it's important that we, one, make sure the conditions are right. Two, make sure that they are the government is assisting people getting to that next phase and not encouraging them to kind of stay in these public housing environments. And then three, I think we really need to make sure that the communities do have the proper resources for the youth in those areas. A lot of, specifically in Woodland Terrace, which we work a lot in, I have 2 mentees there. But I mean, there's no playground. You know, to get to there's only one way in and one way out, which is literally feels like a death trap. If there's a shooting, you only have one way to get out of the neighborhood. The street lights are out, the street conditions are poor. There's one bus stop, so everybody's concentrated in one area, right? Oh, I think there's 2 bus stops, but one side everybody goes to. So it's like a lot of public housing environments are like that, where you have to, the conditions aren't really set up for people to live a positive, healthy, and safe life. And I think that impacts gun violence tremendously.
All right, with that, we thank you so much for joining us.
Thank y'all.
If y'all have questions for folks individually, we'll be here. So thank y'all.
Thanks.